Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Jared. So my name's Travis Mateer. I work for U of I as a beef extension specialist, actually based at the Orr Research Farm in West Central Illinois. I've already had the question, well, whereabouts? And I say east of Quincy, and they say, well, what's closer to that? And I said, there's really not a lot anything closer to that. So we're just east of Quincy, east of the river. Strategically, I love how University of Illinois has placed some of our commercial educators. So my counterpart here in Southern Illinois would be Teresa Steckler, and she's located at our Dixon Springs Research Center. And if you ask, well, if you didn't know where Dixon Springs was, you say, where's that close to? You say, well, it's just north of Paducah, Kentucky. And I guess I should probably start saying that the Orr Center is just northeast of Hannibal, Missouri. So conveniently, us U of I Extension people are located just on the edges of the state. But I want to say, kind of give a plug for some of the guys that are here. Tom Sachs is in the back. We've already had a good discussion. Robert Bellum's here, Dean Oswald. Those guys are the best retired. They're still giving back, still answering questions. And so I've benefited not only from their mentorship, but their additional assistance. So even though you guys are probably still getting a check from U of I, you're still having to earn it, aren't you? Because people won't leave you guys alone and still call you on the phone. But I tip my hat to those guys. Also, Ed Ballard's not here, but he's been a big component of forages in Illinois. But we've got some newer folks that are involved. Doug, you're not new. Doug's in the back. He's going to talk later, all right? But he's a local food, small farms educator for the University of Illinois Extension. Does a great job, so you're going to hear from Doug later. But Jessica School, if you would raise your hand, she's joined us as a commercial ag educator as well. So we do have lots of resources available to you guys, both new and old, Tom, out there. But let me get started here. I want to talk to you folks a little bit about mitigating the challenges of lush forages. When I first started with the University of Illinois Extension, they told me, the gentleman who hired me said, Travis, the biggest thing I can encourage you to do is go out and develop relationships with producers in your area and across the state. And so I took that advice, and I had a lot of sit-down conversations with producers who I was familiar with already from growing up in the industry here in Illinois, but some that I wasn't. And the reoccurring theme that kept coming up was when I asked them, what can we do at University of Illinois Extension, or what is a problem that you continue to see on your farm? The discussion would generally end up with, I have more open cows than I would like, or I have cows calving later in my season, and I don't understand it. And typically, we calve right before we plant corn in Illinois, right? So granted, there are some fall calvers around, but for the most part, we're spring calving here in the Midwest. And so, what challenges may be out there? I think this is a condensed version, but most of us, once we get to springtime, what could potentially be causing problems with cows? Not many of us are going to point our finger at green grass, are we? Green grass is kind of the savior to our year. We're hauling hay and feed and taking care of cows, maybe many in a lot. And then once we get green grass, we can just open that gate up, kick them out, and our problems become a lot less limited, right? Our problems do. But are we providing that cow with a balanced ration? I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves, because these lush, and I've got labeled up here spring forages because we're talking about grass that's getting ready to come on. But these same situations could surface, as Dean's sheet shows. Look at the moisture content of some of these cover crop species. So if these are forages that you're going to go out and graze in the fall, by all means, they may pose some of these similar challenges. So what did we try to do? Our response and response to those discussions that I had with producers, we were also seeing some challenges reproductively in our research herds. So what we wanted to do was take a look at a supplement. Can we intervene with supplement? So by all means, I'm not asking you folks to feed your cows 365 days a year, right? I wouldn't dare do that coming to a forage meeting. We hope that you're going to reap some profit from that forage that you're growing, the pasture, the hay, whatever you're producing. But can we intervene with timely supplementation to help balance that cow's diet? And I think hopefully these slides help illustrate that. So what did we use? We used a mix of soybean hulls, ground corn cobs, and molasses, 4 pounds total on an as-is basis. And when we did this study, we used pen data. So we did not individually feed these cows, obviously. So we delivered 80 pounds of this supplement to a pen, as we had 20 cows in a pen. The cattle were rotationally grazed. The forage species that were present were predominantly endophyte infected fescue, red clover, white clover. We also have some orchard in that base as well. We did an extensive amount of forage sampling, and we had a dryer there on the research center, and so I got to take a lot of fresh forage samples, take them up to the dryer, dry them down, and then calculate dry matter. And so as Dean has it listed here on his sheet, he illustrates it as moisture. I'm going to talk about it in the reverse format as dry matter, because I'm a nutritionist, and that's kind of how we balance rations and things. But as you can see, on the bottom axis here is our timeline. So we started taking a lot of these samples in our area. So again, just a tick north of here at the end of April, and then sampled through those first couple months. So through May and June. And as you can see, in our area, in April is generally when we start to get some heat and some real grass growth, right, in late April. When we started sampling, a lot of our dry matters were around 25% dry matter. And then here in May is when we have rapid forage growth. And you see this consistent dip over 3 years worth of data where that forage is very, very wet, very high moisture, right? So what challenge may that present? So when one of the things, how many of you have ever been convinced by your wife to eat celery? Right? That's not very nutrient dense food, is it? There's a lot of water there. And so it's a great diet plan, isn't it? But there's not a lot of nutrition there. So when cows are consuming these extremely wet forages, they're consuming a lot of water, which doesn't have a lot of nutrients in it. And in our spring calving herds in Illinois, if you think about what time May, the first couple weeks of May and mid-May brings us, that's a lot of time where we're trying to get those cows rebred, right? Then we think about what's a what's a lactation curve look like when we map this over. So this period right here where we're really seeing and sampling some of our wettest, least nutrient dense forages coincides with also the highest period of nutrient requirement for that lactating cow, and some challenges that are associated with that as well. So to describe the pasture to you, we did take samples and send off nutrient analysis, and as we've talked and Dean laid out extremely well, we would imagine that our crude protein is going to decline over time as that forage matures. So all of this stuff makes sense to us. We also, this plot's here to help illustrate that we didn't have any differences between the treatment, so no differences between the pastures that those cows were on. This is just maybe a little bit more and dive into that. So a couple years worth of data to show still, again, here we're moving from protein levels here at kind of those first 10 to 30 days that are above 15%, some of them as high as 20% crude protein in this forage. The other thing that I think needs to be said and we need to realize in this discussion is that in our pastures, this crude protein or our protein content is going to be, for the most part, degradable intake protein, right? So we've overfed at the University of Illinois in various nutrition trials. We've overfed crude protein certainly several times. And if you guys can remember back to the years where byproducts were a little more inexpensive, in the era where we've rolled out dry distillers grains or some of these modified wet products, where sometimes buying those products for their energy value, and we were actually overfeeding protein. But some of those byproduct feeds are very high in undegradable intake protein, and so there is some differences there. Our degradable intake protein is going to be a high percentage of this fraction. I think that's important to note. Yes, sir.
Travis, when you're like in the spring where you have very high crude protein content in the forage, is there an energy cost to the animal for getting rid of the excess protein?
Yep. So I'm gonna talk about that here in some of my conclusions, but yes is the quick answer to your question. So I'll talk about that in more depth here in just a second. So as we continue to kind of map what this forage looked like during our research trial, our ADF and NDF content, as you can kind of allude to, and Dean made the comment, you don't want to stand behind these cows that get turned out to green grass, right? There's not a lot of fiber content there when we first start grazing, but as forage matures, obviously these levels go up, and there is some more fiber readily available. Here's this figure actually just illustrates blood urea nitrogen. That brings me more into the discussion that maybe kind of lays out some of the things that are associated with this excess protein in the rumen. So I'm not a chemist, nor did, like Tom, I think you said you failed your chemistry class, right? So, and we still hired you at the University of Illinois. I think I might have just been slightly better than you, but I just barely made it too. So I won't stand up here and say that I'm just a great example of your chemistry major. But what I will tell you though is that a protein is basically a carbohydrate with an amino group on the end. And so in the presence of low fermentable carbohydrates in the rumen, those rumen bugs actually deaminate the protein because they're searching for that carbohydrate fraction. That's what they're lacking. And so when that protein is deaminated, that's when we have excess ammonia production in the rumen. Then the rumen epithelium is a really neat barrier, right? We can absorb a lot of things through the rumen epithelium into the blood, and that provides a lot of our nutritional components to that animal. But if we have excess ammonia in that rumen environment, it then crosses that rumen epithelial barrier into the blood and is converted into urea. And that's where we see high blood urea nitrogen. And if you're a dairy farmer or have dairy farm background, you probably have tested milk urea nitrogen in a lot of different scenarios as well to illustrate maybe crude protein content in a diet. What we did measure, so we did run these cattle through at certain stages of our research trial to measure blood urea nitrogen. So if we do believe that there's some problems with excess protein in a presence of inefficient fermentable carbohydrate, we're going to see a scenario show up where we have higher blood urea nitrogen. What this slide illustrates is that yes, we had a trend, a statistical trend, for blood urea nitrogen to be higher in our control group or that unsupplemented group of cows. And so this may help explain some of the data that I'll show you in terms of reproduction. Now, we did take some observations along with it. Okay, we know the cows that are loose typically mean that they have a higher protein content to their diet. They also have a lower fiber content to their diet. So there's some illustrations of that. Also, urine pH, and whether you're a believer in that or not, but very basic when we were able to illustrate and show that as well. So kind of the meat and bones here, the results of our trial are conception rate. So these are spring calving cows, and ultimately our goal and how we measure ourselves as a herd manager would be how efficiently we can get these cows bred back and in a timely manner. So the first two bars here were our supplemented group in 2013, and our unsupplemented group were our control group in 2013. And you can see a pretty big advantage for that supplementation, right? I don't know about you guys, but what I'm illustrating here is conception rate to timed AI service. This is about as good as we can do under that scenario. That's a very acceptable number in a timed AI service. This, room for improvement, right? So what did we do the next year? The next year we ran all the cows through on day 7 and drew blood so that we could pull that blood urea nitrogen number for you. Now, as an extension specialist, I've written articles and had conversations where we tell you guys, don't move those cows, don't stress those cows between days 4 and 45, because that's when the embryo is implanting and is very crucial to reproductive success. So what happened, we did stress those cows to get some blood measures, and you can see these numbers just kind of step down across the side. But the thing that's nice is you can still see a numerical difference here, right? So 52% conception to our supplemented group and 38, so a clear defining break in terms of those cows that were not supplemented. So obviously we were having some reproductive failure in those cows, and we would illustrate that to you folks as some nutritional deficiencies that were occurring because we were moving these cows out to this lush green forage. There's some behavioral components that go along with it too, and I'll mention that. But I have to talk cost, right? So here again, I didn't do very good in chemistry class, and maybe I did even worse in my economic classes, but I can still do some cowboy math to figure out what it cost us in terms of our supplement. So our total supplement cost was somewhere around 22 cents per head per day. If you do this for somewhere around 45 days for 50 cows, somewhere of a cost of roughly $500, right? So what's 9 more calves if we use the repro data that we had in a 50 cow herd, so 9 more AI calves. So I should mention here and stop and pause, those cows did eventually get bred. So the reproductive data that I showed you was just for that first service AI. So those cows did eventually get bred, and we would expect them to based off of these numbers, right? So eventually our dry matter comes back up, and our crude protein levels go down, and our forage or our fiber levels go up. So some of this situation corrects itself in about 30 days, right? It's a short-term insult that's a little bit of a timing, and maybe you could say 45 days. But what I'm getting at here is that this short-term supplementation can really pay. So what's 2.5 pounds average daily gain for just that 18-day period, that first cycle? It's roughly 450 pounds more of an animal at $1.30 is $630. So I don't know about you guys, but my AI calves at home are generally worth more than my cleanup calves. If you're just a straight commercial breeder, that may not be the case. If you're just straight commercial, even just the older age and weight at the time you sell those calves will pay for that additional supplement in this timely supplementation scenario. Again, not advocating that you're out there feeding these cows for the whole grazing season. You're just balancing their ration during this short-term insult. Also, we have fewer open cow days, whatever that's worth. We're keeping these cows calving at the front end of our calving season instead of letting them fall out. And then here, if you're a producer that has maybe potentially more AI or value to those AI calves. So I do want to finish up here on this brief version. I've skipped over a lot of the details to this. I am kind of a big picture kind of guy. But if you have more questions about this in this trial, I would be glad to answer those because there are more details here to be talked about. But what I want to draw some conclusions with you are that these lush forages, and here again we're talking on this slide about spring grass, but this could definitely surface itself in any lush forage, so those cover crops as well. may not support peak reproductive performance, and I would say peak performance of any kind. So if you're a producer that purchases cattle to put weight gain on as stockers, which has become more popular. So we don't live in Oklahoma, right, where we're putting calves out on wheat pasture, but we certainly have had a higher instance of folks that are growing rye or triticale and grazing those forages. And if we're going to get the most out of those crops, we have to be aware of what forage we're dealing with and how we can balance that ration. And so make sure that we do that. If we're just a cow-calf producer, I think this is the first question we have to ask ourselves. Are we out of line with our forage? Are those cows correcting themselves by slipping back out of the calving season? Are they just telling us, hey, I should be calving a little later in the year? Or maybe you should be calving in the fall to better align yourself with your forages. So that may be a question you have. A lot of the times I ask that question, the immediate response from the producers is, I want to calve in February and March, and then I want to plant corn and soybeans in April and May. And I say, okay, well, here's how we can help balance those rations for those cows, knowing that there may be some challenges to your timeline. This can be a discussion we could have for the next 2 hours. But bigger cows that have higher milk production have higher requirements. And so what I'm telling you that we've seen in our forage analysis and this short-term insult to where we have this really lush forage is we may not be able to support these really high requirements or higher requirements unless we supplement. So if you're totally against any supplemental feed just because of your production system or your market demands that it has to be produced in a certain way, you maybe need to look at some of these things. I do think there's a need for supplement at this time. I do believe it can be profitable. The behavioral side of this, so if there's a one word that I could leave you folks with, is transition. So if you do anything on your farm better in any area, it should be transition. The times you call your nutritionist and your veterinarian and the times that you're spending a lot of money are generally the result of the lack or the failure to transition cattle from one thing to another. And so the biggest thing we can do is transition those cattle. Think about what's happening. We're feeding cattle in the winter period an extremely dry diet, right? Dry hay, dry supplement, and then we open that gate and kick them out. And they're walking and harvesting their own feed and consuming this really lush grass. That's a pretty rough transition. So they're going to increase their distance to travel. That may increase their maintenance requirement slightly. And we know that animals, they have some behavioral tendencies. So if we're delivering them, okay, when you guys go out in the winter and start that tractor, does that get the cow's attention? She thinks there's a new bale of hay coming to the ring, right? We feed a TMR at the research center. When that tractor starts in the morning, those gals all line up at the bunk and they're ready to go. So there may be a little bit of a period here where those cows have to figure out, oh, that feed truck's not coming anymore, or that tractor's not going to deliver me a bale of hay. So we get those cows kicked off the resort and they have to go back to earning their keep out in the pasture, right? So to recap, the problems are we've got high water content, high moisture, a high protein content, and a relatively low energy content, and I would say a lack of fermentable carbohydrate in this lush forage situation, increased challenges from this highly digestible fraction that just moves right through the cow. Some nutritional solutions, we really need some residual growth on pastures. So one of the challenges is, especially with high hay cost and lack of hay, we don't have a lot of that leftover grass that's out there. But if you're trying to manage your pastures and you know you're going to kick out at this time, it'd be nice to have some of that old straw-like fraction left there, wouldn't it? So you get some lush growth and some mix from some old residual growth. So leave that in the fall, and that can help balance it out. Provide some kind of forage that they're going to eat. So don't sit a bale alfalfa out there, right? Because we have too much protein there. But just some kind of moderate level of forage quality, something that's going to provide some dry matter and something that's going to provide some kind of carbohydrate there without an excess amount of protein. I'm an advocate of supplying some kind of dry, high energy, low protein supplement. Here again, we did that with soybean hulls, ground corn cobs, and a little molasses. Obviously, most of you don't have access to ground corn cobs, but what's another dry, high energy type feed that we have plenty of here in Illinois? Corn. Corn stalks. So corn stalks was said. That's right. Some kind of, what we're trying to achieve here is eliminate these problems. We have resources here at the University of Illinois. They may not be as fancy as these gurus down here in Kentucky, but there's information out there. We'd welcome you to them. I know I was a little squeezed for time here, but I would entertain any questions if you guys have them. Yes, Roger. If they'll eat it. So straw and corn stalks are good, and producers have certainly used those, and they've been effective. But like Dean said, these cows are path of least resistance eaters. If there's that lush green grass out there, they're going to try to balance their ration a little bit, but you can't expect them to eat 3 or 4 pounds of straw if it's just hanging out there and it's that long stem stuff. So processed forages of some type would be more beneficial. A corn stalk bale is probably better than a straw bale because they'll sift through there and find the more palatable fractions like the husk, and that'll help as well. I'd say the failures are just setting out a really rough bale of straw and not getting intake, or setting out a bale of hay like that's very high quality that's not going to remedy some of that energy protein ratio deficiencies that we do have.
Travis, in your data, you're actually showing a benefit to supplementing an high energy source like corn or ground corn.
Yes.
On high quality pasture in the spring, right?
Yes, that's correct. So, I mean, there's some data from Kentucky that shows the benefits of soybean hulls and things like that. But yes, what we're getting at is we just need to balance this ration. We're providing an imbalanced ration to these animals, and I think the disclaimer that I need to mention after we just had that quick conversation is I'm not advocating that you dump 6 to 7 or 8 pounds of corn out there for a cow. There's a thing called negative associative effects, and we don't need to overload that cow with a fermentable carbohydrate or a fermentable starch, right? But we need to balance the ration. So in our case, we're feeding 4 pounds of this mix. A mix that would be easy to put together and is really cost effective would be 2 pounds of soybean hulls, 2 pounds of ground or cracked corn per head per day. Provide enough bunk space so that that boss cow doesn't eat over her fraction, and you're good to go. I'll be around. Yes, sir. That's a good question. So in protein, yes, we've got plenty of data that says because of microbial protein turnover, we can feed every other day. In this situation, I would prefer everyday feeding.
What if you had 2-year-old hay around? They're still going to pick through and eat it, but is that lower enough cost?
I think it would be beneficial. To what extent, I'm not sure. It's all going to depend on what intake level you do get of that hay.